I'm sorry, I'm just hitting the record button because we'll get started here. One, art movement supplants another. It's not so much a question of dominance or necessity. It's more a question of the culture and the environment of that time. What we've seen is how a lot of artists congregated in Montmartre, and they were influenced by one another. All of the folks that we've been talking about in this course, Pissarro, Monet, Cezanne today, and then Toulouse-Lautrec, Gauguin, Van Gogh, all of those folks encountered each other in Paris, in Montmartre, and sometimes in the countryside where they worked side by side. Pissarro and Cezanne worked side by side in the countryside. So they had a social influence on each other. And I'm trying to float the idea to you, which is a belief of mine, nothing more than that, an article of faith, that the important thing is the environment that you're working in, the people that you encounter, and ideas that are current in that particular age, and less an idea that art is somehow progressing.
Drew, can I just interrupt you a sec?
Towards an ideal. Go ahead, Caroline.
Penny, do you have pen toys at AOL.com? Could you resend the link to her?
Sure. Be happy to do that.
Sorry, she just called me and said she can't get in.
The link for this this class?
Yes. I mean, she couldn't find it. I mean, as I always have trouble finding them because there's so many.
I'd have to.
That's right. I'll try to go out and send it to her.
Okay. I don't have the letter where you send me her address.
It's pentoys at AOL.com.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay. PENTOYS at AOL.com.
PENTOYS.
At AOL.com.
I got it. Here we go. Pardon me, everybody.
Sorry.
I can only do less than one thing at a time. And
I send her explicit directions.
yes, we all need to get good at this whole Zoom thing.
Well, the problem is there's so many and they get lost. So it's a good idea to send them out every day before class.
Yeah,
good
I
idea.
know it's a pain in the neck, but
Nothing's a pain in the neck. After everything else that's a pain in the neck, this is a piece of cake.
so did that go through?
right.
I send it off to her. She should be getting that.
Okay.
Takes me a while.
I think, Drew, if you could send the link before class every day, that would be great.
Yeah, I did find it finally, but thank you.
I did too. I couldn't find it either.
Yeah, because now that you're taking more than one class, it's like hard, because
Right.
you have to
Sure.
go back to the link.
Let me, I'm just going to, for the heck of it, put the link up in our chat space here. So if you want to copy that maybe and put it in some other place other than your mail.
I don't know how to copy the link. How do you copy it?
Well, you go over to the chat column.
I see it down.
Yeah.
What?
And
It's a lot to write down.
it's the one that I just put up that ends in .org.
Yeah, but now it's not there anymore.
It's not there.
I had it and then I didn't.
Do you have the chat bar from
Oh
the
yeah,
bottom?
I see it. I see it.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. And
But-
then if you just arrived, I also put up the links to the YouTube recordings of our past two classes. We're recording this one, and that link will be available
I see
after I
that.
upload it later on today. So
I think if you could just like right before the class, just send us all the link. That that would be helpful, okay?
For the YouTube video?
No, for the, like before each class.
Oh, I'll see if I can get a list of your emails. I'm not privy to that list, but Caroline has that.
Oh, yeah,
I'll
you
able to get
should
it
be
from
able
her.
to get in on your faculty ID, but I'll try to deal with that.
All right, or send me instructions on how to do that, and I'll be happy.
Okay.
I'll be happy to take care of that mailing.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm gonna finish it. Am I
No, I
here?
don't see Penny yet.
So do you.
Yeah.
Had you filled in any?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So in any case,
Oh, there you are.
hi.
Penny, hi.
Hi.
Oh, you made it.
Just
Oh,
say hi.
I'm,
There you go.
okay, good to go.
All right then. So today we're going to turn the corner from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism. And that is interesting to me that one movement supplants another. Some of you may be familiar with the philosophy of Hegel, Hegel. I have to spell it because I probably can't pronounce it. It's German. And Hegel had a theory of history. And what he says is that there's a thesis in history, the current mode, and then inevitably comes along the antithesis of whatever that idea was. For instance, the idea of capitalism as a thesis meets its antithesis in communism. And then in the third stage of history, you have a synthesis where the first two ideas are blended in some way. And then I might propose that socialism is the synthesis of the two previous. I'm no economist, just like that guy in Trump's entourage is no doctor, but he does have a degree in social science. So there you go. So I can speak about economy in that way. But what we say about Hegel applies to art movements. You had the idea of Impressionism, which was very much involved with recording natural light and recording in plein air, a painterly term for natural light, and especially the outdoors. So even in the paintings of Renoir that we've looked at, a key impressionist, where he recorded activity in the Moulin dance hall. It was outside, on a dance floor that was outside, and the light was influenced by the trees and the shadows, and he recorded that and did it in such a way that the light was a fluid thing. It was a moving character. And we've seen also the importance of movement and the importance of change in Impressionism, because light is always changing, and Impressionism was primarily concerned with recording natural light. And the next part I'd have to put into quotes, to put natural light as it appears. And we know that there's a subjective ingredient to appearance. It depends on the observer. I think the Impressionists tried to record that point, and we saw how with Still Life by Pizarro, within one picture, the point of light and the relative shadows in regards to the light change from object to object as your eyes move across the canvas. So the element of change was important in Impressionism, but that whole experience was key to what they were trying to convey, that there's movement in every picture, and their concern was still with recording nature as an individual artist perceived it. Now, what we're going to see in Post-Impressionism, which is the antithetical view, is that no other art movement that had taken sway in art and in culture pushed forward the idea of personal temperament with such importance, with methods that allow the expression of the individual point of view by rejecting the notion of objects as they appear in nature. So here we see the prominence of subjectivity being key to post-impressionism, and thus the change from impressionism to post-impressionism. Now, another key thing to keep in mind here, while I continue to make my point that it's a very fluid progression from one mode of artistic thinking to another, and it's relevant to circumstances, and in no way should any one thing be thought of as the culmination of history, the end of movements. And there's a certain irony in what we call the postmodern period, because how can you have a modern period and follow up to that? Modernity seemed to be the end of the road, and it's not. So my point I was about to make is that many of the Impressionist artists became post-Impressionists as they continued to work. They rejected the idea of recording nature objectively and took up the idea of the subjective being their own point of view and what they were trying to express. An example of that is Cezanne, that we'll be working with today, who began as under the tutelage of Pissarro, and also was influenced by Manet, a contemporary. And by the end of his career, he left off the Impressionist idea and became increasingly a person who abstracted his environment rather than record it as it would appear under natural light. The idea of post-impressionism itself, the name post-impressionism, was introduced in a show organized by English critic Roger Fry in 1910 for the catalog of the show. And the name was applied at a time when most of the originators of post-impressionism were dead. So it was a label, unlike other art movements, unlike Impressionism, for instance, which we saw came from a particular painting by Monet in an early alternative to the Beaux Arts show, the official art show. They coined that name themselves. Post-Impressionism, on the other hand, was a label for the group of artists who had learned the application of paint from Impressionist models, but used it in a subjective way that was contrary to the culture of the artists who preceded them. So we see a shift from appearance to experience that often occurs, as I said, in the maturing process of artists who'd begun in the Impressionist mode. And also in post-impressionism has a subcategory, the neo-impressionists, like Seurat and Signac, Paul Signac. Seurat is famous for pointillism, the island on the Grand Jet, that famous picture in the Art Institute of Chicago, and the subject of a Stephen Sondheim musical, as a matter of fact. He was a neo-impressionist, and key there to his difference to his predecessors was that the pointillistic application of the paint was such a painstaking process. Seurat only finished 7 very large canvases in his lifetime. Most of the volume of work that we have by him was studies. And the point is that he's not working any longer in the moment. He's idealizing his subject in a way that the Impressionists abhorred. That's too strong a word, but nevertheless. And then so you see a progression of mores, of culture, and that there's a contingent quality to this, that ideas aren't developed scientifically, they're developed socially, and that's how we should regard these individual movements. Paul Cézanne himself, often called the father of modern art, interestingly enough. So then we would have to assume that most people considered modern art as to be primarily a subjective treatment of what is real, what is out there, by individual artists who claim their point of view as being worth expressing, worth expression. And Cézanne is often called the father of modern art because of his way of abstracting nature, of not attempting to record what everybody sees, but attempting to record what he sees. And he does so with a very painterly and highly developed technique that qualifies him in his age, where such things still mattered. A lot of painters today discard the idea of technique altogether. And that movements like Dada, in which Duchamp was the dominant figure, often had nothing to do with painterly technique. In fact, Duchamp said he was trying to draw in a technical way that was more like a catalog of machines or things that you would buy, and a commercial idea of representing the subject that didn't have anything to do with the painterly technique of the art movements that preceded him. So Paul Cézanne, as the father of modernity, is giving us this point of view where the intellect and emotion of the artist become the gateway to the subject matter, or you could say the subject matter themselves. You know, it's a mystery to me what people are thinking, what their internal life is like. We talk about social distancing. In a lot of ways, I don't think anything's changed. Don't we all maintain a social distance from everyone else? Aren't there actually people in the room with us right now who don't even have their cameras on? And I'm not trying to ask anyone to turn their cameras on, but I'm saying we all pull back from social contact. We all pull back from sharing our internal life, even from our loved ones, even to the people that we're closest to. They don't know what it's like to be us. And part of that is it's so difficult to express what's going on in one's head. You can't even express it with your own stream of consciousness if it were possible to record that. So myself as an artist,
I'll call you later.
Myself as an artist, I'm sort of desperately interested in the internal life of others, which is a great mystery to me. And I'm deeply frustrated by expressing my internal life to others. And that to me is the challenge as an artist. And I look to Cézanne as being an originator in terms of the visual arts, in someone who contemplated that particular problem. Both what is out there and how do I explain my experience of it to others. Let's look at another work by Cézanne. There we go. And let's see, where do I want to go here first? We've seen, okay. You should have a work. Is this a man reading a newspaper?
Yes.
It looks like.
This is Cezanne's father, the banker,
Passport, right, 1866.
a bourgeois man who lived in Provence. Aix-en-Provence was the small town where Cezanne grew up. And it was absolutely essential to his art, his whole life, that the surroundings that he'd explored as a boy, there was no substitute for that environment among any of his subjects. He did do portrait art. He did still lifes. He did absolute abstractions. His late bather paintings, for instance, the one that we have here in the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the same room with Van Gogh's Sunflowers, is a monument to an abstraction of nature and the way he arranges the nudes in that picture. But although he did do work like this portrait that we see here, that doesn't take place outside, key to him was his childhood in Aix-en-Provence. And this picture, although he had a strained relationship with his father, you could say, he also was deeply emotionally attached to his father. And that comes across in this picture of Dad reading the newspaper. You know, notice the casual crossing of the legs and the slight smile on the man's face as he's reading. Those are contrary to the idea of a rigid banker. This character is very much relaxed, and it's, in a sense, a sentimental portrait of a guy who is nevertheless dominating in Cezanne's life and a bit of a terror to him. I mentioned earlier, as the class got rolling, that when Cezanne married, he kept the marriage secret for many years. This again is his, I'm sorry. This again is a portrait of Madame Cezanne. There she is. He kept the marriage secret for 7 years from his dad because he was afraid of meeting with his father's disapproval. Cezanne was raised to become a businessman or a lawyer like his father. Early in his teens, he went to a local college where he met Émile Zola, and they became friends for most of their lives. They were boyhood friends who explored Aix-en-Provence together, and they met up in Paris for a year when,
Not too soon.
in 1861, when Cezanne's father unpredictably allowed him to go to Paris for a year. And he met up with Zola, spent the summer in the Louvre, studying the museum's models of traditional painting. He studied live drawing at the Académie Suisse, where he met Camille Pissarro, who eventually became his mentor. And he became despondent at his lack of success, and he soon returned to Aix-en-Provence, working in his father's bank, but also back in his hometown, attending a local drawing school. It was intended that he would become a lawyer, and he started law school. It was an absolute disaster for Cezanne's temperament. In 1862, his father permitted him to leave off these bourgeois aspirations and gave him an allowance of 125 francs per month. He set up a studio at home but after a while, that arrangement wasn't working out for the members of the family, and he returned to Paris, where he met Manet, Degas, and Sisley. And he applied at the École des Beaux-Arts, but was rejected because they felt that his paintings were overwrought. In other words, that they had too much overworking of the paint, which is very obvious when you see certain artists' work. Paint should go on in a single stroke, and when you keep manipulating the paint, it takes on a muddy appearance, an overwrought appearance that for some artists, like the German expressionist artists, for instance, the overworking of the paint is essential to their expression. But at the time that we're talking about, and especially with the Conservative Beaux-Arts Academy, that would be seen as a flaw in Cézanne's technique. And he didn't catch on in the Beaux-Arts, and he didn't catch on in Paris. He wasn't commercially accepted in Paris. He did, however, meet in 1869 Hortense Fiquet, a 19-year-old bookbinder and model who would become his lover. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, Cézanne decided to spend the time with Hortense in Lestat in southern France. But despite the relationship, which he kept secret for the next 8 years, he still felt lonely. His son was born in 1872, his son Paul, and the family moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, where he worked closely with his friend and mentor, Camille Pissarro. Pissarro, who 9 years older than Cézanne, was sympathetic, tolerant, and a born teacher, almost like a surrogate father. Cézanne's own parents, who may have been viewed as conservative, as I said, did not themselves wed until after their 3 children was born. What he got from Pissarro was advice. Although Pissarro is historically the first person to paint in the Impressionist style, the origins, the founder of the movement, so to speak, is usually attributed to Monet, who made the eponymous painting that gave Impressionism its name. But Pissarro was the first to do this sort of experimentation, and he was a very kindly teacher, and filled a void for Cézanne in that he had a difficult time with his father because his father had no sympathies or understanding of his son's artistic bent. And Pissarro, as an older man who shared his technique with him, gave him valuable critique of what Cézanne was doing, gave him the advice to remove the dark colors from his palette, not to paint with black, but only with the 3 primary colors and their derivatives. Cézanne took his advice, and the creation of his dark, expressive, intuitive paintings came to an end. Let's see, we have another early work by Cézanne here. 1873.
We tell you to put the crackers in the salad. I remember that.
This is a fantastical painting by Cézanne. It's called the Modern Olympia, and this is from 1873. In 1874, the first exhibition of the Impressionists was held at the photographer Nadar's studio. Cézanne showed 3 paintings in the first exhibit of the Impressionists. Monet was not impressed and described Cézanne as a bricklayer who paints with a trowel.
It looks like Chagall.
2 years later, Cezanne showed 16 paintings at the third Impressionist exhibition, but after a hail of criticism, decided not to show with the Impressionists again. Now, essential to Cezanne's character was his fear of criticism or resentment of criticism, which, as we know, that is about the insecurity of the person who's receiving the criticism. Some people appreciate the advice of others and appreciate other people's impressions of what they're doing because it can improve you if you incorporate other people's points of view, that mysterious point of view that other people have that some of us are interesting to find out about, and others spend their whole lives shunning. Folks who can't accept criticism and have to always be seen in a positive light by everybody there, everybody who talks to them. Don't talk to me unless you give me a compliment first. That shows a deep insecurity. Cezanne, although I don't think he was a morbid person, nevertheless couldn't handle rejection. And when he decided not to show the Impressionists anymore because his work wasn't appreciated, he held back and wouldn't show with them again. And throughout his life, that sort of isolation from criticism, isolation from journalists. He was uncomfortable with having anybody see him work, for instance. That was a very, very private matter. His friend Emile Zola said that he would never be able to achieve anything as an artist because he was so prickly about rejection. And I think Zola perceived at least one thing correctly, and that is if you're going to be in the arts, you're going to have to get used to rejection. That's basically the story. And that if you're doing something worthwhile, especially if you're breaking new ground, you're going to need to expect to get some resistance. And Cezanne, who I think most people would agree was a genius in terms of his radical redefinition of painting, didn't have the temperament to push his ideas forward against that resistance, although privately his art was the only thing he cared about. It was the spark of his whole life. He worked incessantly and but had to go it alone because he wasn't able to handle the social give and take that being an artist in society requires. Let's see. I'll move a bit forward here. 1876.
Just leave them in that little.
Sounds like a politician we know.
I was trying to make that illusion without saying it aloud, but
I think we all got it.
I think you did too. I think you
Yeah,
did.
I thought immediately of it.
Well, I don't assume everybody feels the same way I do about our current politics, and I won't make that the subject of the course. But he is a good example of the basic insecurity of people who can't accept anything but unabashed love from everyone they're talking to. And you see where the difficulties of that arise. Other folks might have useful advice for you from their own perspective. I mean, I used to work in a group home with juvenile delinquent boys, 9 boys in Chicago who were adjudicated youth, Some of them were juvenile delinquents. Some of them were in the witness protection program. I bring this up because we taught social skills, and the two basic social skills are following instructions and accepting criticism. And the steps for accepting criticism are really simple. You look at the person and you say, okay. Now, what that leaves out is agreeing with the criticism. All that means is that you're going to hear the criticism. But if you grew up in an environment where there wasn't much love around, and where criticism also was accompanied often with blows or curses or vilification, then you don't learn how to accept criticism gracefully. And the students in my house, my group home, where I was a live-in teacher, they often would act violently. One day I woke up and went into a boy's room, told him he was late for school. I left his room expecting him to wake up, and he did. He came out with a baseball bat and hit me as hard as he could in the hip.
Wow.
So all of us have difficulty accepting criticism, but some of us learn it as a simple skill, and you can learn from criticism even without necessarily agreeing with who's giving it to you. It just requires socially a little bit of grace to accept that difference of opinion to your worldview. Let's look at it for a moment at this picture from 1876, Le Basson du Jas de Buffon. And you can see what it shares with Impressionism, and that is the use of bright colors, the banishment of black from the composition. And you can see also that it's much more abstract than the work by Renoir. Renoir has a real gauzy effect to it, but that's his interpretation of the light. Here, we see that, for one thing, there's no real perspective here. Everything is up on the surface of the canvas. There's no depth to it. It's presented as a pattern. There's perspective drawn in here, but there's no long-range perspective that goes back to the horizon, as we were taught by the Renaissance painters. If you look, I think my pointer shows up on the screen here. If you look at like the representation of the tree trunk here, or this sculptured figure next to the reflecting pool, the brushstrokes are very quick, and the movements are automatic. So it shares with Impressionism the idea of a gesture of painting being predominant. But what it doesn't share with Impressionism is he's not being very exact about the application of the paint. And I think the overall effect is pleasant, nevertheless, but we have to see that as being different from the Impressionist model. Now, as for Monet's criticism, that he was like a bricklayer with a trowel, if you look at this stout tree virtually in the center of the canvas, there's this little point right here where you see green laid next to...
I'm not seeing the pointer. I don't know if anyone else is.
Me neither.
Okay. I
Interesting.
can't make that come out. But you can actually see the brushstroke where the paint is raised from the background. You can see the application of the paint here. Paint as paint rather than essentially a dye on the canvas. You can look otherwise too. The tree on the far right-hand side that has this dark amount of shade. There's a shade of blue up here where you can again see how the paint has a depth on the canvas. He hasn't mixed it. He's applied it practically out of the tube without any kind of oil medium. and the brushstroke is raised from the background. Now, if you think to your experience of Van Gogh, whom we'll see next week, Van Gogh is known for this, a thick application of paint. And that is part of what makes these artists post-impressionists rather than impressionists, in that they weren't so careful about the application of paint. Or another way to say that is they applied paint and used paint in a different way, and technique wasn't so essential to what they were trying to express as color and the subjective point of view were. And then,
Although it's interesting that he has the reflection of the trees in
Right.
the pool.
Yes.
Like Manet stuff.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and then as a subject, you could say, and rightly so, it's Steve, right?
Howard.
Oh, I'm sorry, Howard. There you are. Yes, you could say that is a carryover from Impressionism, because there's nothing more transitive than the surface of a pond, and that very much has to do with light and reflection. So yeah, it does have a lot to do with Monet's Water Lily series, and I think that's an apt comparison. Next, a painting from 1883. This is called Houses in Provence. And then you can see how the application of the paint here sometimes doesn't even cover up the ground of the canvas. In other words, there's a light undercoating to this surface, a light undercoating of paint that was applied first to fix the canvas for the application of the paint. And he's not obscured that equally across the whole painting. And this is very clearly departure from the more formal technique of the Impressionists, who, of course, were a radical departure from the Romantic and the classical artists who preceded them. But if you look in this lower left-hand corner here, you can see the brushstrokes right in the lower left-hand corner. You can see the brushstrokes overlaid over the light ground underneath them. From a naturalistic point of view, there's no justification for that, but that wasn't Cézanne's concern. Another innovation of Cézanne's, he did paint with a trowel, in a sense, because he painted with a palette knife. The Romantic painter from the era that preceded the Impressionists, Courbet, C-O-U-R-B-E-T, he also used a palette knife to apply his paint. And what Cézanne did, if you look at the way the buildings are here, is he would construct three-dimensional objects by overlaying three different shades with a palette knife in a pattern that formed a three-dimensional trapezoid. And that's what's going on with these buildings. And if you look in the foreground, these rocks that appear there, again, you see swatches that were applied with a paint knife, a palette knife, rather than with brushes to give you that same three-dimensional effect, but to do it in a way that is anything but overwrought, as the Beaux-Arts criticized him for being in his early phases. He certainly got away from overworking the paint. And here, the technique is very immediate, and you could talk about an indefiniteness, certainly, to his representation of the subject, but that comes from embracing the idea that the subjective opinion, because it's only mine, isn't universal in any sense, but he's trying to express what he sees. And as I mentioned earlier, this takes place in in Provence, which was a landscape that was wholly essential to Cézanne's development as an artist.
Drew, I have a question.
Sure, absolutely. Here's
In the lower center of the painting, what appears to be
I've lost your sound. Hello? Am I still here?
Yeah.
Hello, can I be heard?
Steve.
I can't hear you, Steve.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Now I do.
Okay.
We go back to the picture?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for just a minute.
No problem. Here we go. All right, the lower center.
Yeah, with the lower center, it seems that what appears to be the letters of his name seem almost like little twigs that are growing out of the ground. Can you see where I'm looking?
I do see what you're seeing, and that does look familiarly like his signature. I think he's depicting a wall along a pathway there, and I think that they are supposed to be twigs. And the reason that looks like his signature is the way the paint is applied. This is my art criticism here, and I don't have a more learned opinion to back me up.
Okay.
But I think the reason it looks like his signature is the way he's applying the paint is very automatic, like a signature is, and so his rendering of the twigs is similar to his rendering of the alphabet. You know, it's a kind of calligraphy, and we see that a lot in 20th century art. And that's my take on that. If you have an alternative explanation for it, but I like what you say. I think it's a keen observation to recognize the hand of the artist. You know, that's something that's a modern art value in itself, that the hand of the artist, the thing that makes a painting unique to a particular artist, becomes elevated as a proper subject, and not only that, but a thing to be valued. The hand of the artist, the way you can tell, you know, a picture by Cézanne from a picture by Van Gogh or Monet or Jackson Pollock, for that matter. We can identify artists from their personal calligraphy, their personal style of applying paint. De Kooning, for instance, had a brushstroke that had a characteristic hook at the end. And in the case of a series of nudes he did, that got him in a lot of trouble. Let's see. Let me put some other work up here. Maybe a few more pictures, because we're gonna run out and we'll be able to get to my friend Trek. I'm gonna show something. I'm gonna leap ahead to a late work by Cézanne. Okay. Hello, boys. There's the bather. And
They should get a tutorial in Zoom before they do it.
No, he's reading his script. He has no idea what people are going to ask.
No, but he needs to put a picture up.
Yeah,
And he doesn't know
it's up here.
where.
Everyone is hearing you.
I know, and I'm perfectly content with that.
Okay.
This is later work, The Bather. I was looking for a photo to show you of the group of bathers in the
We've seen it.
Philadelphia Museum of Art. But here's a single bather. Notice the unfinished quality of it.
Oh, yeah.
Cézanne's later portraits, which are quite moving, are nevertheless not finished in any way, and he didn't regard his work as being finished in any definite way. And there's an indefinite expression on the figure of his bather here. What's interesting to him here is the pose of the bather. And look at the background. It's again not definite. We see a sand stretch and a rock rising out of it. The bather may be entering the water. That might be water under his feet. But if you look at the background behind it, it's almost like a photographic cloth. It's almost like a backdrop, and less certainly doesn't have any perspective to it. It doesn't have any depth. So his interest isn't in those niceties. It's in presenting the form, the hues of the paint. The composition is made of color, and the rapid motion of the brush, and is less concerned with the idea of portraiture. So in a lot of ways, this is a classic figure in the landscape, if you will. Just because I'm going to run out of time shortly, let me show you a contemporary of Cézanne's.
10 more minutes.
And that would be Audrey Toulouse-Lautrec. And we all know Henri. He had an absolutely different point of view about what the subject of art ought to be. He considered that only the human figure exists. The landscape is only an accessory, and his work usually takes place in dance halls. I'm sure you've heard of the Moulin Rouge, probably thanks to the John Huston film, the most famous of the Moulin dance halls. And like the other artists we've talked about, he was very concerned with working class amusements and popular life, popular culture, not at all interested in the niceties of landscape. Let's see, just to get to some absolutely key figures by Lautrec, and I'll go through them one at a time. Let me pull up. I had to put things onto my desktop so that I can then show them to you. I'm looking for one more painting here. Let's look at this. All right, we'll do this guy first. This is interesting to me. Welcome to the age of photography. For the first time, I'm going to show you a picture of one of our artists taken by a photograph. This is trick photography. This is done by the photographer Guibert, and it depicts Toulouse-Lautrec painting Toulouse-Lautrec. I did that with a split screen. You may know Toulouse-Lautrec as opposed to the myth of the starving artist in Montmartre, the bohemian living a hand-to-mouth existence. Lautrec was from an aristocratic family that had a family name that was 1,000 years old. Lautrec actually had the French title that was equivalent of a count. He would have inherited
that title from his father, but Lautrec died of alcoholism at age 37 in 1901. He was born in 1864. When he was very young, 8 years old, he broke his femur, and then later broke his other leg. And this is a portrait of Van Gogh from 1887 by Toulouse-Lautrec. So there we have an interesting confluence. If you check while I'm talking here, the brushstrokes here, Lautrec painted on cardboard often. It had nothing to do with him not being able to avoid canvas. He liked the way the oil spread out on the cardboard backdrop, and he was innovative in his use of paint in that way. Some of his best work has an unfinished cardboard ground right behind it. So it's an extreme version of what Cezanne did in the picture that we saw earlier.
Yeah.
Feeling all right?
Bless you. Let's see.
No fever.
You should
I'll
take
show
cold
you the kind of picture
and the vitamins.
he's most known for. This is at the Moulin Rouge. As Monet did, as Renoir did, he characterized people he knew in Montmartre society in his picture. I don't believe Lautrec appears in this particular canvas, but this fellow here, this tall fellow who's dancing with the woman in the red stockings, was a famous Montmartre character who came in and dazzled everybody because he was so tall and wore a tall hat and was a skinny fellow. Additionally, Lautrec was very sensual in his approach and very much a fan of the famous dancers at the Moulin Rouge, like Avril, Jean Avril, and Gogh, the famous Gogh, an early form of Madonna, because she just had one name. They were famous dancers, and Lautrec, although he was essentially a dwarf and not pleasant to look at, and very, very sensitive about that, he had a very small chin and wasn't an attractive fellow, but he was valued for his skills as an artist. He was valued for his skill as a caricaturist, and this is how he compensated for his deformities. If I can be a little loose in my application of psychology here, but I mean, it seems pretty evident that he became a great appreciator of the human form, because he himself was so handicapped in that way, or should we say challenged. Let's look at some more of the great Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec is his family name. It's an area in the Pyrenees area of France. And let's see, I just go do one of these guys. There we go. It's an area in France. This is a picture of the dancer Jean Avril. I'm looking for it on my screen. Are you seeing that now? Yes, you are. There you go. Jean Avril. There you go. That's a cardboard ground without an undercoating of paint on it. He's just dotted the colors, and even so, he's represented the movement of the garment in the figure. His rendition of the face is a caricature rather than a formal portrait. He had a very fluid line that was almost a cartoonish style, and I don't mean that in the Bugs Bunny sense, but more in the ideal of Hirschfeld, the great Broadway caricaturist, That sort of caricature is essential to Lautrec's style. Very humorous in his rendition of character, rendition of individual people. And then we see how Impressionism here is going from not only from the idea of capturing a moment in light, but also the idea of fleeting individual personhood, essential natures of a character. Now here, the other thing Lautrec is famous for was his poster art. He was a master of the poster, and this is something he was hired to make by the Red Mill, Moulin Rouge, to feature the dancer Gogh. There she is in the center. There's that tall and lanky figure who's a famous dancer, and then the crowd in shadows represented as all black figures. Lautrec was innovative in the French art scene for his use of broad masses of single undifferentiated color, very much like the poster art that we're familiar with today, the commercial art we are familiar with today. And in this picture, you see some highly worked portions of the painting, like the portrait of Gogh, the central figure herself, and then we see other features reduced into shadows, and then some things represented in broad, undifferentiated color. No shadows, no side-by-side brush strokes of different colors that were essential to Impressionism. And then the lettering in the poster, of course, becomes something of the art too. We're going to see that again when we look at the collage art of Picasso in the 20s, or any number of 20th century artists who worked lettering into their painting because it's reminiscent of advertising. Lautrec was an innovator in that regard. For Lautrec and also Van Gogh, I've mentioned this once before, Japanese prints were widely circulated in Montmartre at the time. They hadn't been seen up to this moment because they weren't available to anybody unless they went to Japan. But with modern printing, images like that were popularized, and Van Gogh and Lautrec especially were influenced by that. And then as the hour closes out here, I'm not going to stop talking immediately. I'll get to the end of the sentence, as it were, as far as Lautrec goes. This is a circus picture. This is also in the Art Institute of Chicago, as is his most famous at the Moulin Rouge painting itself. This is a circus picture. He was he hung out in brothels. A lot of his work were intimate pictures of prostitutes in brothels who were his only romantic contacts. He contracted syphilis in his 20s and was an alcoholic by 1889. It got so bad that his family institutionalized him, and the way he convinced his doctors to release him from the institution was by painting a series of circus pictures, of which this is one. And then again, look at the caricature, the inky outline. It's not ink, but ink-like outline of the horse to render that horse. I mean, it's fabulously Disney-esque, if you ask me. And that's a facet of Lautrec's that's very subjective, individual. Look at the broad stretches of undifferentiated color, like the surface of the ring here. Look at the theme of the dancer, the showbiz personality, not only the ringmaster, but the woman on top of the back of the horse. That showbiz fantasy was part of Lautrec's oeuvre, very much so. The spectacle of society, the spectacle of life, and a marked difference from what was important in terms of subject matter for Cezanne. But if we're talking about one art movement succeeding another art movement, there's a thread here in that both artists were willing to portray their inner life as a suitable subject for public art. And I admire both of them very much, not only for their courage, but to me, just the beauty of what they were able to accomplish. Any ideas, questions, responses?
Mr. Zimmerman, this is Dr. Christine Grad. I never
Hi.
received notice, hi there, about the first class.
Okay.
Second class, I hadn't gotten any notice either.
Okay.
And I've gone through my email searching for the links and so forth,
I have
and I
the
can't
solution
find.
for you right here on your screen. If you have the chat thing open on the side of your screen there, inside of your display, if you have it there, I have two links there for YouTube recordings of this class. And the class that we're finishing up right now is also being recorded, and I'll put the link up for that. That'll be available. If you want to write me, I can. If you'd like to see a recording for this class, you can write me at this address.
I got on very late.
No problem. We've got you covered.
What about, did you record the paper 57? What's in gray now? That's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misspelled my name here. It's paper 57 mache.
Okay. Email you at that address?
You can email me at this address, and I'll send you the link to the current class.
Right.
And then the links in the chat section, the very first entries there, it says icons of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And then you have a blue line that's underlined. If you copy that link, either copy and paste it, or if that doesn't work, just to copy it out by hand. I'll keep it up there on the screen. I won't cancel out this class for several minutes. Those are links to recordings of the first two sessions of the class. And if anyone would like to write me to see any of my collections of pictures, other students have done this. I'd be happy to send you the attachments any of the artwork I've shown you in class, and be happy to send you again, if you're not able to get them from this chat display, the links to the YouTube recordings of our past sessions, because they're just that good, aren't they?
They are.
Any other ideas, folks, or comments?
I thought they were really unusual paintings. I hadn't really seen them in years. I thought it was an interesting selection.
Yeah, I don't know how I selected them. It's very difficult. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. What makes a picture a classic? We all have our own opinions. I think something has to do with where they're available. In what institution are they shown? Museums go out of their way to acquire the best work of an artist, and people who have a more highly defined aesthetic than my own make those decisions for institutions like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which has Cezanne's monumental bathers. You know, one other thing that would be great to show you just as we close out here, because it's so interesting to me. I'm going to show you Cezanne's studio because it has interesting features. contrary to the idea of the poor starving artist, Cezanne acquired his father's estate in his inheritance and was able to build himself a dream studio there in Provence. And this is the interior of Cezanne's studio. Notice the north-facing window in Provence with curtains on the side so that he controlled the amount of light that was here. The ceiling is probably 15 feet tall. You see a ladder over on the side here. That was so he could reach the top of really large canvases like the Bathers in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And then over here on the far right side, you see what looks like a gray slot in the wall there. That was specifically built so that these monstrously large canvases could enter the studio through a slit in the wall. They're already stretched and framed, so it wasn't any good to roll them up and bring them in the front door like a Christmas tree. They had to be pulled through, at their full height and width. And he had his studio built explicitly so that he could do it. As I say, a dream studio, and goes quite contrary to the idea of the starving artist represented in movies like Moulin Rouge by John Huston. Anything else?
That was great. I'm really enjoying them.
Oh, thank you so
Yes,
much.
me too.
Deeply.
This reminds me of my first trip to Paris in 1962. My friends and I went to the Folie Bergère and clubs like that in Montmartre. So we're about 18 years old. Didn't know French then, but we had a great time.
I'm sure your interest was wholly in the arts and aesthetic.
Of course.
Of course it was.
You got the atmosphere that these guys are painting. That was still the atmosphere, just different kind of costumes.
Absolutely. And, and now, now as then, it's a commercial atmosphere. That's what they're selling, the history of art and attractive women in interesting costumes. Anything else?
Thank you so much.
Thank you
guys.
very much.
I look forward
Thank
to these
you.
meetings. I'll see you next week for our final class, and we'll spend a lot of time on whoever I talk about first, and we'll hurry through whoever I talk about second, because that's the
Drew.
way I roll.
Happy holidays to everybody.
You too.
Happy holiday. Drew, could you, by any chance, send out a reminder? We've talked, several of the students are have been in classes. If you could send it out on Monday, sometime with all, just the link and everything, it would be very helpful.
I'll do my
It's
best.
very helpful because if you're in several classes, it's very confusing.
Yeah, sure.
Exactly.
I'm going to get a copy of everybody's addresses. I'm going to send you a reminder for the next course, and then I'm going to hit you up for cash contributions to the Democratic National Committee. Okay?
Yeah,
All right.
good.
You'll be on my mailing list from now on. Say, don't you love Joe Biden? And it'll ask you for $25. All right, so that's it, folks.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
Reminder with
Thank you.
Happy Passover.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Have Passover.
All right, then.
All of that, all of the above.
All of you.
I love it.
Bye.